Hi everyone. I can't believe that we're already on our second to last Google Classroom video. The year is almost over. But we have another topic to go over to prepare you for your competencies assessments at the beginning of the year. This week, we're covering a reading comprehension skill, using background knowledge to sequence and evaluate sources. Ready? Let's dive in. For today's Do Now, we're asking, what context can you use to evaluate this source? Jot down a list of these contexts in your notebook using only the information provided. And remember, the contexts are the circumstances that form the setting of the source. Pause the video now and complete the Do Now. That wasn't too hard, right? The contexts you should have identified are the following. The author, that is, who wrote or edited this source, and what connection do they have to the subject matter of the source? Date of publication, when was the source written? And 3, source location or type, where did you find this information? For instance, is this written in a newspaper or an academic journal? Is this an opinion piece, otherwise known as an op-ed, or scientific or academic research? Finally, you want to find out about the intended audience or purpose of the source. Who is it intended for? And why was the source written? Now that we've gone over the different contexts that you can use to evaluate a source, let's reflect on why this evaluation is essential to your comprehension of that source. Knowing who the author of a source is can provide good context to what shapes the viewpoints expressed in the source and help you assess its credibility. For example, if you're reading an article about Somaliland from someone who is not Somali or has never lived in Somaliland, you may want to closely evaluate how accurate the content of the source is. On the other hand, if you find a similar article written by someone who is from Somaliland, you may want to closely evaluate any bias contained in the source, since its author is so closely related to its subject matter, even if they may be a much more credible source. Looking at the date of a source helps you understand its place in the dialogue of the subject, in relation to the events around it. This will enable you to sequence your sources more. For example, if you're reading an article about the Soviet Union from 1988 and another one from 2011, you may be reading them and getting different opinions about the same subject. In 2011, you can probably assume the author has more information on the subject, but the author in 1988 may more accurately give you information about people's attitudes about the subjects in 1988. Recognizing where an article comes from and its intended audience tell a story together. Let's take a look at the Wall Street Journal. Perhaps you've heard of it, or at least Wall Street, the main financial hub of the United States. If you're referencing an article written in the Wall Street Journal, you can safely assume a few things. 1, that it has a pro-capitalist leaning. 2, that its intended audience is Americans, especially Americans engaged in business. From this source, you know that the credibility on economics and business is high, yet in political issues, you'll get a more elite right-wing opinion, which can be said about the New York Times as well, except that the opinion there would be elite but left-wing. As an example, we're going to look at an article from the British newspaper The Guardian and compare it to Crossbones, the book you're currently reading. The article is called Mogadishu's Miracle, Peace in the World's Most Lawless City. You can find the article on our Google Classroom page under the Reading Comprehension tab. In a few seconds, I'll ask you to pause the video and read the article. After you do this, compare the article to the book in terms of the context we went over in the Do Now. That is, author, date, source's location or type, and intended audience or purpose. When you finish your comparison, answer the following question. How do the differing contexts of the book versus the article affect their views of the Union of Islamic Courts? Let me give that to you again. How do the differing contexts of the book versus the article affect their views of the Union of Islamic Courts? Pause the video now. Okay, now we're going to go through the context of each source and analyze the implications of their differing contexts. Let's start by looking at the author of each text. Nuruddin Farah is Somali and grew up in Mogadishu. Thus he is writing about his home in Crossbones. On the other hand, Zan writes as a reporter for The Guardian, and at the time he wrote the article, he was the newspaper's East African correspondent. The publication dates for these sources are extremely significant. Crossbones was published in 2011, 5 years after the founding of the Union of Islamic Courts. Mogadishu's Miracle was written at the founding of the courts in 2006. Farah chose to voice his opinions through a novel. His decision to write this novel in English indicates that his novel was intended for an international audience rather than a purely Somali one. Rice's article was also written in English and for a British newspaper, thus also indicating that he intended it for an international audience. Let's think about the intended purpose of each source. This context is a bit more subjective, and so you may have different answers as to what it is. I'm going to provide you with what is only one interpretation of the source's purposes. Farah gives an overall negative review of the courts, saying several times through his characters that the courts are no better than the warlords who preceded them. Hence, one can say that the purpose of Farah's work is to expose the lack of substantive change in terms of governance in Somalia. Ruling entities might have different names, but Farah seems to be arguing that the same problems persist. In contrast, Zan Rice gives an extremely positive review of the court. He is writing for a foreign audience for whom Somalia has always been a region of instability and violence. News that the regime had finally emerged to ensure peace and stability was welcome. Rice's purpose was to convince the reader that Somalia had turned the corner for the better under the rule of the courts. I had asked you earlier to think about how the differing contexts of each source affected their view of the Union of Islamic Courts. I want to quickly pivot back to that, specifically to the publication dates of each source, which I said was significant. The fact that Farah published his book in 2011 after the rise and fall of the UIC gives him the gift of hindsight and reflection. He can fully condemn the courts in his critique because he knows their full history, that they would lose the war against Ethiopia and be dismantled shortly after they obtained power. Rice does not have that gift. He is writing in the moment, before any of this history has played out. Rice is writing before many of the more extremist laws passed by the Islamic courts had been implemented, before the Union, and more importantly before the UIC declared war on Ethiopia. That took a lot out of me. At times I couldn't remember what I had to say next. Anyway, that's it for this week's lesson. For the assessment this week, we want you to go onto the internet and find a source of your choosing. Once you've found and read your source, identify the context in which it was written. Who is its author? When was it written? What type of source is it? Who is the intended audience? And what is the purpose of the source? Submit your answers to the Google Classroom page. Please include a link to your source so that we can see it ourselves. Let us know if you have any questions. We'll see you next week.